part of the ESG task force. And yes, so I'd like to welcome you to our first webinar as the task force in partnership with FSD Africa and the Actuarial Society of Kenya. I think ESG is a very hot topic globally. And us having this particular webinar will be able to shed some light on some of the issues that we are having or we're currently experiencing in terms of sustainability and climate change. Yeah, so at this juncture, I'd like to hand it over to I think Sahib, who is the president of the Actuarial Society of Kenya, to just give a brief introduction. And yeah, feel free to post any question on the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of this particular webinar. So yes, welcome all, and over to you, Sahib.
Thank you. Please confirm, Lucy, you can hear me?
Yes, I can proceed.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And for members joining us from other time zones, greetings to you from the Actuarial Society of Kenya. I think that has been a very good introduction from Lucy, who is providing support to the ESG task force, accumulation of efforts from the Actuarial Society of Kenya and FSD Africa. So this is currently from the view of the task council, a very active engagement area, and we are very happy that the actuaries are part of this and leading this initiative, very ably led by Elias as the chair of the task force and all his members, who today, some of them will give us some insights. So very exciting build up to this in terms of the content that's been shared via email, in terms of what we're expecting to hear, both in terms of the education group head Sheila and her presentation, and thereafter the panel discussion on all matters to do with ESG, tackled from different perspectives of environment, from the social front, and of course the corporate governance front. So welcome once again to all members who are joining from all over, and thank you for making the time. And I hand it over to the team, to the chair Elias, to introduce the agenda of today and have good deliberations. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Sahib, and it's great to really have this particular gathering. And yeah, so I just want to first and foremost appreciate and really thank the members for attending this particular webinar. Also, I want to thank my team that we've been working with, the task force members. We've really managed to get some traction so far, so good. And I think it will be important for me to really highlight what we are doing on that particular front. And maybe just to also mention that ESG task force was formed after we basically signed an agreement with the Actuarial Society of Kenya. And as a FSD Africa, we are keen in building readiness for green finance, and particularly looking at issues around ESG related risks, but also opportunities, because one of the key things that we need also to highlight is that we should not only focus on the downside of this component, but also what opportunities can we get out of this particular process. Importantly, yesterday I was going through an article that was highlighted Financial Times, and there was one lady that has kind of complained and have sued an institution, given that she really wanted to invest her monies in an institution that would basically put her investment in fronts that would support ESG, this particular ESG principles. And once she went through that, she managed to get to know that her investments were just invested in fixed deposits and was not in any institution that was adhering to, or basically was not basically invested on green investments. So the key question that came into my mind is that how then do we move this discussion from what we call more of a compliance issue to more of a strategic issue. And maybe it will be good for me to just take you through a couple of slides this morning, just to get us going in regard to this particular topic. So let me know if you can see my slides. I'll just go through them very quickly, just to highlight what we are doing as FSD Africa. So if you can see my slides, let me know. So
yeah.
Right, so it's great that we are having this task force, and ideally what currently at FSD Africa we are working on is integrating this in the first 3 countries, that is Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria. And with the current work that we are doing with the task force in Kenya, we believe that this could be transitioned across the continent, just to ensure that, yeah, there is traction around that. So just a couple of slides. I need to talk about African vulnerability. Why is this particular topic really, really important? Why do we need to think about climate financing? What's the role of the financial sector? How do we look at issues of green finance, given the story that I've just highlighted of a lady that has sued a company that had an ESG policy and kind of mentioned to her that most of our monies would be invested in green investments, but that was not the case. The money was just put in a fixed deposit. Then what are we doing as FSD Africa? Then maybe just look at the kind of project outcomes that we are going to get out of this particular exercise. So importantly, Africa is still in a very dangerous position, and particularly on issues of climate. And one of the key things is that Africa is exposed to the global emissions, yet the contributions around these emissions are very minimal. Also importantly is that African GDP would ideally go down by around 30% if we don't really address these issues ahead of time. And over and above that, 30 out of 40 most vulnerable countries in terms of climate are basically within the sub-Saharan Africa. So that really means that we need to do much more when it comes to these levels of vulnerability. We need also to highlight how much financing has been coming our way. And even if we are in the need of greatest adaptation, only 7% of the global climate finance is directed towards adaptation in Africa. And that basically means that we might need to get more funding, given that you can ideally see that only 546 billion was invested in combating climate change, which was highly inadequate compared to what we really needed in Africa, which was between 1.6 to 3.8 trillion dollars, just to ensure that we could transition to low carbon transition. Now, what does that mean? We really need to work hard to ensure that even if we are not getting this funding coming through in Africa, but we are already looking at ways in which we can make our continent adapt to these particular changes. So we have a very important role as a sector, and basically as a professional body, we need to look at how then do we direct rightful, I would say, components around climate, around capital and risk investments, which, because these particular issues of capital and risk play important role in driving both the climate change mitigation, but at the same time transitioning to a nature positive future. And that's the need of the financial sector really sitting at the integral part of making this particular change. Yeah, so why is it that even if we talk about this vulnerability, we need to really push around green finance? Because Most countries still in Africa have inadequate policy and regulatory frameworks for green finance, and that kind of expounds the long-term challenges that we face with in regard to the long-term financial issues. So, for instance, I know in Kenya we've issued some green bonds, and kind of that has kind of taken a very slow takeoff, and maybe we might need to do more just to ensure that there is right policies and an enabling environment to ensure that this discussion just goes beyond an issue of just nicely written articles or nicely published regulations. Second thing is that, we need more financing, and here we need to mobilize international and national climate finance just to ensure that we strategically have a place in terms of solving the challenges that are facing more than half of the African countries. There's also skills, and you'll be able to see that within the task force, there are various work streams that we are working to ensure that there are rightful skills, both in the public and private sector. That means that we need to look at how then we harness the opportunities that come within this particular component. One of the other things that it's great to mention, only 19 of direct access entities in Africa are accredited by the Green Climate Fund, and that kind of hampers our access to the Global Climate Fund. So can we get more financial institutions accredited towards this Green Finance, Green Climate Fund? So that's why we did initiate a Nairobi Declaration, and I know that we will be having a discussions around that, because today we have Dorothy within a team of our panelists to kind of highlight what we are doing around getting more entities signed up and to push for more funding from the Green Climate Fund. Now, FSD Africa really looks at this from a bottom-up approach, and I know the term bottom-up has been used in various ways. Now, this is the real bottom-up that maybe people around the borders of Kenya might already have come across that term. So we look at raising awareness. We want to ensure that there is already a proper understanding of issues around green finance, and that means that it will provide more transparency in terms of the challenges, opportunities, and the risks that African investors will be facing together with their institutions and regulators. The second thing is leadership and governance. We want to ensure that we build a strong leadership culture, a strong governance culture, not amongst the investors, but that would be extended within the financial institutions and the regulators. And this will, in a way, facilitate the necessary change towards green financial outcomes. So we are keen to build a key leadership team within this particular discussion. Another thing is innovation. We want to see how then we can provide tools and thought leadership that will encourage innovative thinking in creating green transactions. Importantly, it's good to mention that FSD Africa will be launching a climate accelerator program that will ideally be focusing on a number of innovators around Africa to be supported towards creating the solutions that are going to address the challenges that we are currently facing in green finance and climate. So already we are highly looking at innovators and trying to provide guidance and resources for those particular innovators. At the end of the day, skills are important. We need to create the right competencies, at the same time really deliver the outcomes that will change our environment and also our social and governance issues going forward. So we have deliberately taken this particular type of approach to get ourselves going. Just to talk about the ESG integration in these three countries. So we know very well that if you've been interacting within the insurance industry, one of the key things is that you're aware that the role of a financial regulator is highly around prudential and issues around market conduct, so more of consumer protection. But over time, we've seen the insurance regulators' mandate being broadened to include societal risks and also development objective. And that really means that ESG comes at the center of every regulator's supervisory realm, so that they are able to identify, monitor, and prioritize risks that would, in a way, affect their mandate around societal and development objectives. So we've gone ahead and we are working with the insurance regulator in Kenya. We are working with the insurance regulator in Nigeria, and also we are working with the insurance regulator in Ghana. And in this, we'll be able to enable them to adapt to a more relevant context and capacity that will ensure that their frameworks really take into consideration the ESG principles that will guide those particular markets going forward. So I've mentioned that, yeah, we are working with the IRA, we are working with the National Insurance Commission in Ghana, and also the National Insurance Commission in Nigeria. Over and above that, we'll be working also with the insurance companies in those particular 3 countries. Recently, we did work on Nairobi Declaration in Nairobi. We are going to have that declaration in Lagos next month, and probably we'll be able to see more insurance companies signing up to ESG. We are working with a specialist ESG consultant, and also we've collaborated with a number of insurance training institutions just to ensure that there is proper capacity around this particular topic. Some of the objectives of this ESG is that, yeah, we want to establish perceptions, capabilities, and practices of the insurance, African insurance industry towards addressing ESG risks. And I thank the team that we've been working with at the task force, because that is one of the areas that we are keenly looking at in how then do we ensure their capabilities and right practices around addressing ESG risks and issues. The second component is that we want to support actions and initiatives, and in that build insurers' technical capacity. So over and above that, we have a very clear strategic approach in terms of providing the necessary capacity, the necessary training, just to ensure that as we integrate ESG and we look at ESG-related risks and opportunities, then we get the right initiatives working and enabling us to move towards these particular objectives. Another thing is that we want to launch a coalition of industry champions, and today we are going to also get more champions that are attending this particular webinar, who will advocate for stronger ESG considerations in this continent. And at the end of the day, wherever we are working with the regulators, we want to ensure that we are building an enabling supervisory environment, so that ESG does not only become a compliance exercise, but an exercise that really guides strategy and decision making within the financial institutions. So the assignment will look at 3 key components. They need to diagnose what is the current trend and what is really happening on the ground in regard to the ESG related risks and opportunities. Will also equip in terms of providing a framework and a toolkit that will enable them identify and assess ESG risks, and over and above that, then also look at ways on which they can identify what we call opportunities. And then the last thing is basically integration, whereby we build capacity, we train and produce and develop a common understanding of ESG around the global best practice within this very deliberate approach that we are undertaking. So the outcomes is that there will be a gap analysis report, then there will be a fit for purpose recommendations that will engage in terms of producing guidelines and toolkits. At the end of the day, then we are going to make a clear change management through a lot of engagements and advocacy. So just back to the ESG task force, I'm happy that I'm with my team today, and this team has really done tremendous work, and I want to appreciate the work that is being done by Sheila, that leads our training team, and this is all work that they have already put together in terms of getting this webinar out. But that does not mean that the other team members are not working. So the purpose of ESG is to drive and support readiness of financial sector in managing ESG risks and in supporting green finance. And with that, then we thought of how do we achieve this key mandate that we've been given as a task force. So we've so far developed 5 work streams, and we are still onboarding more people that would support us in this particular front. And I will just kind of take you through what the work streams have been doing. So we have a research and innovation work stream, and this is headed by Cynthia. What they're doing is basically they're leading the research front in terms of how do we address the risks that are associated with physical transitional liability risks. How then do we also drive product services innovation within the financial sector? And in this, we are looking at creating a green lab, and soon we'll be getting this out to you guys on how you can join the green lab. And we are also conducting research on a number of ESG issues really affecting Kenya and also the African space at large. And when you come across our survey that we will be issuing out in the next couple of weeks, kindly help us to get that out so that we get to know what is the perception within the sector. The second thing is that we are working on reporting and disclosure, and this is led by Cosmas. And Cosmas is working in terms of enabling us to develop an ESG reporting and disclosure guideline, and in a way ensure that there's a disclosure taxonomy. Now, the reason why we are doing this is that already there are so many fronts whereby we are looking at ESG as an exercise of or as a PR exercise and an exercise that makes us look good as different institutions, financial institutions. It's important to ensure that there are proper reporting and disclosure so that you can be able to adequately have a matrix of knowing how a company is performing when it comes to the ESG protocol. So Cosmas and his team is working on this reporting and disclosure. I know that they are in the call, and in any time you guys would want to have questions on, they'll be able to answer. Also, we are having a training and education work stream, and this is headed by Sheila Gatu, and she will be helping us to ensure that we are educating the sector, we are providing them with the right information, we are educating our regulators, and also we are bringing in our stakeholders towards signing up to sustainable finance and investments and going forward. So yeah, so in this case, then we are looking at how then we bring knowledge to you, how then we bring capacity to you, and how then do we guide this discussion going forward. So that's good work that is being done by Sheila and the team. And also we have policy and regulations work stream, and this is headed by Ezekiel. And what Ezekiel and his team is doing is they're looking at how then they would support the development of ESG policy guidelines and regulations. And in this, they're working closely with policymakers and regulators, because we believe for us to make the rightful change in this industry, we must enable the policymakers and bring them at the center of the discussion. Then we have the engagement team headed by Njiru, and he's our PR guy. Yeah, he's the guy that really ensures that we look good. So he'll be supporting us on a number of PR activities and just ensuring that the stakeholders are able to sign up for initiatives such as Nairobi Declaration, and also engage on various campaigns. So maybe soon we'll be inviting you guys for a walk in Karura, and hopefully you'll be able to join us as an engagement exercise as we also look into having fun on a green environment. I want to end at that, and mine is to appreciate everyone that has joined us today. And in any case, we have you have any questions, we'll be able to take those questions at the end of this particular webinar. Also, we have a great panel of speakers today, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, they did agree to be in this particular gathering. I'll pass it back to Lucy, who is guiding us here. Lucy, or I don't know, it's Sheila. You can take it from here. Thanks. Thank you, Sheila. You can take it.
Thank you very much, Elias, for that brief introduction to the work that we are doing. And we are very happy to be educating the rest of the industry about ESG. And so without further ado, I will start the session where I take us through what we're going to be doing today on ESG risks. So my name is Sheila Gatu, as Elias has said, and I'm the chair of the training and education work stream within the ESG risks panel. I also work at Zamara, Rwanda as the resident actuary. And today I have my distinguished panelists with me, starting with Dorothy Maseke, who is currently the group head of risk and compliance at ICEA Lion Group. The group has interests in life insurance, health and property, life insurance, asset management, and is one of the largest financial services groups in East Africa. She's a committee member of the IRM UK Special Interest Group, as well as a task member of the UNEP FI Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Insurer Pilot Group. We also have Shera Noorbhai joining us, and she's the head of the governance, risk and compliance function at Zamara, and she's responsible for all companies when it comes to governance across the group. She's a director at Corporate and Pension Trust Services, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Zamara Actuaries, Administrators and Consultants Limited. And she's an associate actuary with 25 years experience in pensions, medical, and trusteeship. She's a leader with high integrity, with familiarity in financial management, asset consulting, risk management, and compliance. Lastly, we have Ayandev Saha, who is currently working with KM Dastur Reinsurance Brokers, leading initiatives on climate risk adaptation and insurance and social protection schemes. He has over more than 10 years of design and implementation of experience in pension, life, health, and agriculture insurance schemes across the African and Asian regions. He has led several donor fund projects and advised governments, regulators, associations, and insurers on social security schemes, regulations, and strategies for building mass markets. So before we go into the discussion with the panelists, I just thought it would be good for us to define what does ESG actually stand for. I can see from the responses that you sent when you were registering that most people actually know that ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So basically, when we're talking about environmental risks, we are saying, how does the financial services industry support the transition to a resilient and net zero emissions economy? When it comes to social risks, we are asking ourselves, what are the risks that arise when a company has the absence of strong employee engagement, a good human rights track record, employee diversity, and fair labor practices? So what are the risks that arise out of that, and how can we mitigate them? And then when it comes to governance, we're asking ourselves, what are the risks that arise from a company that has the absence of an independent and a diverse board, fair compensation practices, executive pay, and anti-corruption? And normally, when it comes to governance and social risks, the risk that arises out of that is mostly reputational risk. So when it comes to climate-related risk, which Elias has already touched on, we normally look at 3 areas. The first one is physical risk, which arises from changes in the weather and climate. And I'm sure we can all attest that we've been seeing that. If we think about the recent famine we had in Madagascar, even right now in Rwanda, it's February, it's not supposed to be raining heavily, it's raining heavily. So I'm sure we are all feeling the effects of climate change. So basically that is what physical risk is. And then we have transition risk, which is the risk that can occur when a company is on a path to a carbon neutral green economy. So say, for example, right now, today, the Kenya government was to say that in 1 year's time, all the bodabodas in Kenya should be run on electricity. They should all be electric motorbikes, for example. What would be the risk to the economy of that? So transition risk is any risk that occurs as we are transitioning to a greener economy. And then lastly, liability risk, which is very relevant for us as an insurance industry, whereby it's the risk that arises from people or businesses seeking compensation for losses suffered due to physical or transition risks. So for example, somebody's car, somebody's house gets damaged by a flood, and that flood was caused by climate change, and the insurance company has to compensate. So when we're talking about climate-related risks, those are the 3 focus areas. So what are the implications with financial institutions, largely because we do have in our audience people who are not in insurance? When we look at investments, pensions, and asset managers, basically ESG risks comes in when we're looking at our investment portfolio. As we embed ESG risks into our investment portfolio, we'll no longer be looking at market returns, we'll also be looking at ESG issues. When we look at banking and finance, ERM and governance issues, ESG will have to be embedded into those. And then when we look at the capital markets, when we are pricing financial instruments, so when we are pricing things like bonds and shares and so on, we'll no longer just be looking at market risk and credit risk, we'll also now have to be looking at ESG risks. And so even as we transition to embedding ESG risk into our economy, these are the kind of ways that sectors of our economy will be affected. And then lastly, with insurance, I believe most of our audience is in insurance. How will ESG risks apply for us? Firstly, when it comes to transactions, in both life and non-life insurance, there will need to be a need for a greater due diligence when it comes to transactions. So for example, for a company that has embedded ESG risks, they can actually decline a client just because he has an energy portfolio that consists of fossil fuels. When it comes to operations and strategy, for example, in underwriting, and I'll give underwriting as a good example, when you're underwriting a fire risk, normally you'd look at things like the number of floors of the building materials, and so on. Now you'll also have to look at ESG issues. Is the property seated on riparian land or not? You'd have to take into account things like that in underwriting. In product development as well, we need to look at things like, does that product have gender equity, for example? When it comes to claim handling, we have to look at treating customer fairly issues. When it comes to the S, are we treating our customers fairly when we're handling claims? And then overall, when it comes to the company strategy, we'll no longer be talking about a risk appetite when it comes to numbers. We'll be asking ourselves, what is our ESG risk appetite? And then lastly, as Elias touched on, as the industry, we have a big role to play in terms of society. We need to ask ourselves as an insurance industry, how are we helping society to prevent themselves from falling into poverty? How are we preventing the vulnerable from falling into poverty? And Ayandev will actually help us to answer that question today. So for example, using crop insurance and universal health care. And then we can even think broader to broader societal issues. So for example, when it comes to drug use prevention, this is one of the areas where our young people are vulnerable to falling into poverty. What are we as the insurance industry doing about that? So those are some of the questions that I'll be asking my panelists about today. And I'm very excited to have the three of them. And so we will dive right in. We will dive right in to the questions, starting with Shera. So Shera, welcome very much. And the first question I'll be asking you is, under governance and when companies are looking at implementing an ESG framework, S&P Global normally assesses companies' governance frameworks by assessing 4 different factors: structure and oversight, code and values, transparency, reporting, cyber risk, and systems. So under structure and oversight specifically, will companies need to redesign all their processes to accommodate the mitigation of ESG risks?
Many thanks, Sheila, and good afternoon, everyone. I think, yes, companies would have to do that, but I think, as both yourself and Elias have alluded to, I think ESG is one of those things that we're all waking up to, especially in this part of the world. I think maybe the Europes and the Americas of the world are a few steps ahead of us, if not many steps ahead of us. But I think on this side of the world, there's a lot more education, etc., that needs to be done, to get there. And I think, to use the example that Elias gave, that we have the one green bond, the ACON. But, the question is, did people invest it because it was called a green bond, or people invest in it because it got a greater return? So I think there's a whole education journey that needs to be undertaken to get people to understand why is ESG important? How is that going to translate to? And I don't think it's necessarily just about climate. I think it has to do a lot more with the entire circle. So as much as an insurance company will say, I'll not take your business because you are your carbon footprint is horrible, we're also going to get to a point where a client is going to say, no, I'm not going to choose you as my insurer because your ESG track record does not exist. So I think it's going to be a conversation where the center keeps expanding or the circle keeps widening, and we are going to have to look at it differently. So yes, companies will have to redesign it. And I think there's a lot of help that companies are going to need to understand, all these nitty-gritty stuffs that we need to change.
Thank you, Shera. And I love that answer that even before we look at redesigning our processes, are we even educating our staff, our boards, our management about ESG? And so I love that. So the insurance industry, pensions industry, you've had that. We first need to start by educating our staff, our boards and management and so on. So Shera, specifically when we talk about social risk, we said social risk arises out of companies not taking things like employee well-being as a strategic point in their objectives. So how do we manage the mitigation of social risks with making profit? So for example, if we realize that a lot of our employees work overtime and because of their well-being, we see the need of paying for them taxis to go home, right? That would be taking care of their well-being. How do we manage such issues and balance them with profit, making profit?
Okay, thanks, Sheila. For me, that's a bit of a controversial question, in the sense that for a company, if I've hired you, Sheila, to do a particular job for me, then I've given you deadlines that you're aware of. If I've given you timelines that are unreasonable and you have to work late, etc., then yes, I need to cover whatever I need to cover. But if I've given you enough time to do your job and you're just, lack of a better word, faffing around and you're staying late because you're using the internet to watch YouTube and what have you, then why am I paying you for your cab? But, having said that, on the same vein, I will send you to different countries or different towns for meetings, and I'll cover your cab costs to get to the airport and back, which says then, does it really matter whether I'm staying late or the reason I'm staying late? Shouldn't you cover it? But again, the other side is I have shareholder interests that I need to take care of. So I think we are going to have to find a middle ground, but it's going to have to be a joint middle ground where we understand each other. I've given you these timelines. If you tell me that timelines are unreasonable, then yes, I will help you or support you in doing those things. But I think related to that also, we have to be cognizant of the changes in the whole employment frontier. The people like you and I, the reasons we work, our parents, the reason they work, the reason they stayed with an employer has also changed. So, people are looking more for fulfillment of their work rather than the paycheck. So even when it comes to ESG, you might also come, employees saying, well, do you have an ESG framework? Because I would want to work for a firm that has ESG standards, for example. So I think that whole conversation is going to change. And that will form part of, yes, I'll cover your cab because, yes, I have an ESG framework. Or, okay, no, you're a good negotiator, I'll cover it for you, sort of thing. So I think that context is going to have to mold itself to something different to what we have today.
Wow, excellent. So basically dialogue. Employees and employers, the whole dynamic, the whole relationship will have to change. And a lot of that will be driven by dialogue and the different demands, shifting supply and demand when it comes to employment. Great. So my last question for you before I move to Ayandev is when it comes to employees once again, right? Now we're talking about governance. When it comes to governance, we need to put in processes to make sure that the company is not losing money, for example. So how do we get employee buy-in when it comes to tightening some processes? So for example, an insurance company wants to tighten its claims processes to make sure that there's no fraud happening. But the employees feel, no, you're just wasting my time. Why do I not need to go through 5 extra steps to check a claim? Why does the claim need to be checked by 5 extra people? What has been your experience in terms of getting employee buy-in when new company processes are introduced that will actually help the company to make better returns?
Okay, I'm going to break that question into two. One is getting employee buy-in, And then the other one is understanding whatever you're doing, whatever processes you want to put into place. So employee buy-in is a very difficult thing. I mean, I've done a couple of system changeovers and I could have pulled my hair out many times. I probably have a wig right now, but anyway. So employee tie-in has to be linked with what are you trying to achieve and why are you trying to achieve it. So I think communication there is critical. So when it comes to fraud and things like that, it's also having standards that you abide by, but standards that you believe in. So it's almost a case of, as you're recruiting, are you looking for the attitudes and not necessarily the CVs? I have XYZ qualifications, but you also have the right attitude, because that has to do with your governance standards. You have certain beliefs and you abide by them, irrespective of who's telling you to deviate from it. So yeah, I think there is a need, for that whole process to do with, again, training and education. Guys, we want to do this and these are the reasons we're doing it, because if we achieve this, we're also raising our own standards, our own benchmarks, and our own, true north, as it were. We're staying true to our north, whatever we believe our north to be. So if we believe our north is being crooked, fair enough, guys, let's do that. But if we believe our true north is doing the right thing all the time, then you have to carry people along as to why we're doing it. And these are the things. And maybe, sometimes the 5 processes may not be right, but if you haven't had that discussion with your team to say, okay, if not 5, how? So that you get that buy-in. Sometimes I think the challenge always is sitting at the top. You think you know everything, but sometimes when you're on the ground, you know where the shoe hurts. And, if you work with a team on the ground, you know what needs to change and what things you can do better. So again, for me, it has to do with dialogue and walking the journey together.
Great, Shera. I love that. And, I actually hadn't thought about the aspect of recruitment decisions when it comes to getting employee buy-in. Like from the very beginning, are you hiring employees who will be open to change? I hadn't thought of that. So, I mean, I love how you've basically reminded us that when we're talking about ESG risks, we first have to start with education and diet. The questions. Thank you, Shera. So moving on to Ayandev. What are the key areas of focus when we're determining a framework for mitigating? And here I'm talking about insurance companies, regulators, social security providers. What do we need to think about when we talk about the mitigation of social risk? Yeah, so welcome, Ayandev.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Very good afternoon to everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. Yes, Sheila, so let me give a little different perspective, because I think we all of us read a lot about ESG on through various forums, through various information that is there in the public domain. But let me take this opportunity to put a different context. And let me start with the context of COVID-19, climate-related disasters, the famine that we are hearing now, especially in the eastern part of Africa and various other areas in our continent. This has led to similarly unprecedented challenges in terms of public health, food system, and even the world of work today. And when we look at who are the people who have been suffering the most, it is the most vulnerable, where you covered and somewhere in part of your presentation. And also it's creating and worsening the gender gap. Today, if I just go by statistics, 100 million plus people have been pushed into extreme poverty, and at least twice as many as into poverty. So I think this level of challenges, I think it's actually making us a wake-up call, and the importance of aligning our economies, especially economies, to the SDG for building resilience. Now, there is no better time, Sheila, I think now than any time before, to focus on the sustainability in our recovery, be it from pandemics, recovery be it from the famine or the climate change related crisis that we are going through. And I think to do this, we can harness the power of finance, be it insurance, be it banking, innovation and technology, and to drive the transformation in all sectors of the society and improve the lives. And that is where your point was, in social aspect of it. So I think what important is how we connect SDGs to the current ESG measures. And somewhere you touched in the introduction. If you see, I strongly believe that ESG is not very well aligned to SDGs, right? And that is important. The companies, the investors, the insurance companies all need to speak a common language for business decision-making, investment strategies. The SDGs should allow businesses to consider financially significant regulatory, operational, and ethical problems relating to the goals, which strengthen their existing ESG framework. And if you ask me, Sheila, why I'm focusing so much, on the linkage, and I keep telling this in various forums that there is a need for alignment. Because today, when you look in some of the developed markets where there is a well-established ESG framework, you will realize that the companies today, without naming any one of them, getting very high ESG scores from the biggest rating firms. They are also typically amongst the largest holding for ESG funds, largely because they rank high on parameters such as corporate governance, greenhouse gas emission. However, if you look into their core businesses, they involve in manufacturing and marketing of addictive activities, which is actually increasing your mortality and morbidity, right? So I think somewhere we need to think. And that is where I believe, if we are creating a framework, it is very important on how we link ESG and SDG. For me, SDGs are the why, in short, and ESG is the how. So ESG factors can be roughly translated to SDGs on the corporate level as unique parts of ESG considerations, which can be assigned to all the 17 goals if needed. Yeah.
Wow, that is such an amazing perspective. And I would actually call on my colleagues in the panel that I think even as we come up with the disclosures and the reporting requirements and all that, we really need to think critically about that. And I love what you said, the SDGs are the why, and then the ESG is the how, because I believe in Africa, we cannot afford to ignore social issues.
Absolutely.
We cannot. And so for sure, when it comes to Africa specific reporting disclosures and an ESG framework, for us, SDGs will have to be core in answering the why. So thank you for that. I love that answer. So specifically when it comes to agriculture insurance, because I think that's a good example where the industry can play a part in mitigating, in preventing the vulnerable from falling into poverty. How does agriculture insurance actually address that issue and mitigate the vulnerable from falling into poverty?
Absolutely. Again, when it comes to insurance, again, Sheila, let us go back take a step back, and there has been, again, a lot of documents and literature to say how insurance can actually contribute to sustainable development goals, including there has been a report from A2I, the Access to Insurance Initiatives, and various other organizations. I think the insurance can actually plug the gaps in the social safety net, provide better working condition, and prevent household, and especially the farmers, from falling back into poverty. Now, when it comes to agriculture, let us look at our continent, Sheila. Like 30 to 40% on average of the GDP is coming from the agriculture sector. When we look at the livelihood, 70% of the farmers or of the livelihood is in agriculture. So this is two significant components. You can't just go without it, be it economic terms like GDP or be it in terms of livelihood. Now, on the other hand, with these two, comes the third challenge. The third challenge is to feed the people, right? And we all know by 2050, the world will have 9.7 billion people, right? Our agricultural land is not growing and we are facing a lot of challenges. Now, today, if we really need to achieve food security, and again, it is very important when you brought, smallholder farmers and look at the agriculture sector, the 5 of every 6 farms in the world today, Sheila, consist of less than 2 hectares of land. And they produce roughly 35% of the world's food production, right? And this is not my statistics. This is as per FAO, right? The Food Organization and 2021 report. So this, Sheila, clearly emphasizes that we not only need to focus on agriculture, specifically, we need to focus on the smallholder farmers. Now, why agriculture insurance is important, and I think somewhere there was a question as well in terms of the politics and the insurance and how these two things comes together. I think the agriculture insurance is one such thing. Why is I'm saying so? Because agriculture productivity can only be increased through agriculture finance. And today, if you see the agriculture, Sheila, finance is not happening, Sheila, because of the inherent risk that the sector has. The farmers' risk related to climate change, related to production-related risk, it can be pests, disease, and so forth. Now, this is where the insurance can come in. And insurance can be seen as one enabler for agriculture finance. And and again, this goes back to my, the first question that you asked. Today, if you see, agriculture is contributing to various SDGs. So it's contributing to no poverty, it's contributing to zero hunger, it's contributing to climate action. So today, if I'm an insurance company and if I am trying to be part of an ecosystem which has agriculture insurance, and this insurance is bundled with agriculture finance, which is enabling the transformation of the agriculture sector in terms of commercialization, usage of technology, and so forth. So for me, that is how I see agriculture insurance contributing and the reasons for that contribution.
That's amazing, Ayandev. And what I'm just thinking is that as the insurance industry, when we watch documentaries about poverty in Africa, we can no longer say that there's nothing we can do. It's no longer the problem of the government. You've just shown us that actually we have a huge role to play. And
Absolutely.
So before I move on to Dorothy, I'll ask you just one question. So does that probably mean that if we do this right in Africa, an insurance company, for example, that underwrites agriculture insurance would have a high ESG rating?
Absolutely. You see,
because
that is
of the S.
Sheila, you're asking a very pertinent and very important question. And that is why I'm saying, why is it important that ESG needs to be aligned with SDGs, right? And I think across the world, we all trying to achieve SDG 2030, right? It goes without saying, be it government, be it a private, or be it even individual as a citizen, as a global citizen, right? So I think it goes without saying. Now, you see, agriculture is aligned to SDGs, right? As a sector, it contributes significantly to the Sustainable Development Goals. And today, if you create a framework, if you create a reporting framework where ESG is aligned to SDGs, then you will actually contribute significantly and you can actually get higher score. Else, that is one of the reasons I never like to give that example. But today, when you look, some of the companies have very high ESG scores, but they are actually detrimental, if I put it that way, when it comes to good health for everyone or some of the SDG parameters.
Great. Thank you so much, Ayandev. That was such a fresh way of looking at it. And I think it will be important for all of us to look at ESG in light of SDGs. So moving on to Dorothy, I can talk to Ayandev for the whole hour because that is my area of passion, social protection, but I need to move to Dorothy. So Dorothy, welcome. And Dorothy, we now want to turn our focus specifically to insurance and insurance practices. So I'll ask you, how does the E in ESG apply to underwriting specifically?
You know, Sheila, there's something that Ayandev has just mentioned that to me, I'll just selfishly pick it like my opening remarks. You know, the question on whether, and I think you asked it, Sheila, if you underwrite insurance, for example, would you have a high ESG rating? I think just as I speak about the environment side, it's important for us to also understand that all these aspects are very interrelated. So and if you may allow me to just very briefly speak about the Nairobi Declaration, one of the things that we are challenging underwriters, and by underwriters we mean ourselves, is how do we look at, you know, the E side or the ESG side in terms of new products and new solutions that actually address the ESG challenge. And yes, so that basically means that as an underwriter, ideally, if you are to do the how, what Ayandev is talking about, it means we have to look at products that focus on, you know, renewable energy, agriculture-related kind of products. When it comes to the investment side, the green finance instruments. So ideally, that is where, you know, that is a place that will be more sustainable, you know, in future. So specifically, you know, in terms of the E, in terms of underwriting, I think it's important for us to understand the interlinkages between the E side and climate change. And many times, you know, we speak and you find some specialists maybe separate ESG from climate change or climate change from ESG. But I just want to mention that, you know, a modern or current school of thought is that they're all highly interrelated. And the climate change aspect is mainly covered under the environmental side. Because, you know, with climate change issues, and that's why everything is moving towards net zero. If you're able to solve the climate change challenge, then you're solving quite a number of environmental challenges that come about. So on the east side, you know, there's climate change, there's environmental degradation, there's, you know, protected sites and species. You know, many times we hear stories about turtles in Watamu, and you say, well, it doesn't matter, that would never apply to me. But all these species, when you get to read and understand, they actually play a very key role. So biodiversity protection, you know, is very important. Actually, they say COVID was a zootonic disease. It's a zootonic disease, meaning humans interacted so closely, you know, with wildlife, you know, game, meat, etc. And that is how diseases are passing from, you know, wildlife or wild animals to humans. And COVID is one of those, as you know, the history of COVID. And so that brings to light the fact that as underwriters, we need to look at it in terms of what are those ESG risks. So I look at it in terms of 3 buckets: understanding the environmental risks, which I've just mentioned, and then looking at the economic sectors within which you operate. You know, do we insure dams? Do we insure agriculture and livestock, as we say, you know, transport, shipping, logistics? I mean, if you insure marine, for example, there are certain things we offer marine insurance, but there are certain standards even these, you know, vessels need to adhere to, you know, to protect the oceans. So there are so many things that you need to look at under the economics sectors. And of course, that is across the 3rd bucket, the various lines of business. You know, Sheila, you just talked about physical risks. You also talked about litigation risks, and of course, the transition risks. So across all these lines of business, is it, you know, workman's compensation? Is it some liability class that you're looking at? Is it marine hull? You know, so all these lines of business. So the E side is very important. And the question is, when we are underwriting, going forward, it will be expected that we start considering whether to underwrite a project based on doing screening on the environmental side. And this screening could look at things like the kind of, like you said, environmental damage, you know, even things like liability risks. Ladies and gentlemen, you know about the Lamu coal plant. You know, that was one class action suit that actually won a powerless community against a large business. And that case is online. And for them, they were saying, look, they were not involved in this process. And they were talking about the damage that they're expecting. And they were saying, as stakeholders, you know, in Lamu were not involved. And most of all, they said, you're building in close proximity to a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that is how that coal project stalled. So the community is very powerful. And you can imagine if you had taken on a policy or underwritten this particular project, imagine what risks you'd face 5-10 years from now. So it indicates that we need to do a lot more when we are underwriting underwriting going forward. We need to think of environmental data. When a client comes on board, you need to ask for those environmental impact assessments. I know as underwriters, we ask for them, but do we even follow through what those reports are saying? You know, we need to take into consideration available data. The International Energy Agency, for example, it has a database that you know, highlights a lot in terms of, you know, potential opportunities and also potential risks. You know, apart from that, when we are underwriting, say, a dam, you know, because some of these businesses are quite huge, you know, when the premiums come in, we are smiling. But when you're underwriting the dam, this kind of, you know, specialist projects, what tools or what frameworks are we using to actually underwrite? Or do we just get a rate from our reinsurer, or we say this is so big and then we front it 100%? You know, what exactly do we do? And basically, as an underwriter, it means we need to start looking at specific tools and frameworks, including things that are specialized. The World WWF, the Wildlife WWF, right? It's actually working on a paper, a guidance paper on hydropower, you know, and that paper is basically saying that, or the project is basically to help underwriters know the right questions to ask should they insure hydropower projects. You know, there's geothermal that you all know about that is also coming about. And basically what we are saying is that there's a lot of information, public information. The UNEP PSI has an ESG underwriting guide. It is online. I'd encourage anyone who wants to understand ESG in underwriting, asking the question, where do I start? What do I do? The guide for the general insurers is online. Have a look at it, and it explains exactly what you need to do, starting with setting your ESG risk appetite, you know. And then we have World Heritage sites, for example. When you're underwriting, it's good to know, are you underwriting something that is within a protected area? You know, then there's a task force. It's called the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures that is working on what will be very useful for you as actuaries and accountants in future. You know, how will organizations of financial sector industry disclose their exposure in terms of nature-related issues? So there's a lot, but I just want to mention that there's lots of guidance. You may feel that there's information overload, but there's lots of guidance on what exactly you need to do as an underwriter.
Wow, I love that, Dorothy. And I think what we'll do after the webinar is to actually send the link for the PSI guide to everyone who has attended this webinar. I think it will be important, as you said, for them to have a start. So thank you for just, I think you've demystified how we would actually take account of environmental risk in underwriting. And when you are talking, I love your passion. And one of the things I just thought is that basically, this is how the insurance industry will add our voice to environmental issues. And our voice is big. We don't use it enough. We have a lot of power in the economy. And this is specifically with underwriting. This is one of the ways that we're actually going to add our voice into the issues of environmental issues and climate change. Awesome. So Dorothy, maybe I can just ask you one more question. Now, when it comes to product development, right? There's recently been the proposed geothermal underwriting pool that has been set up in partnership with FSD Africa and Kenbright Insurance Brokers. So it's an underwriting facility that mitigates the low probability and high cost risk of unviable wells. So it will use insurance capital to de-risk the early stage development of geothermal projects, making it easier for projects to attract private investment. So basically, it will attract investment because now an investor will know, even if I invest in this and we find an unviable well, insurance will cover that. What are the opportunities for underwriters in Kenya for that particular product?
You know, Sheila, as you know, fuel prices are getting higher, and renewable energy sources are becoming, you know, more popular. And not just popular because it's, I think sometimes we jump onto bandwagons and we use terms because they sound, you know, they sound like the flavor of the month. But, you know, renewable energy sources are definitely more sustainable, and countries, including our own, are pushing for more investment in renewable energy projects. Now, what does that mean? That means there's a lot of financial capital flows from even external markets coming in country to fund this kind of projects. You know, if you look at COP26, the pledges that were made to Africa, even to Kenya as a country, are enormous. Now, these pledges are not going to, you know, these pledges, if they are fulfilled, will definitely go to that particular aspect, what you're talking about, climate change. And renewable energy is one aspect that introduces, of course, new opportunities, but also there are certain risks that come about, especially in light of the heavy investments, upfront investments that they take. And that's possibly why the uptake has not been too good. And this underwriting facility, from what we understood when we sat in the first session they had with us, is to, like you said, how do you de-risk this aspect, enabling it or making it easier for projects to attract private investment, and also for these projects to actually take off, because they're also very high risk projects. Now, I'll talk about the challenges. The challenges are lack of technical capacity to underwrite. It's new, it's early days. I think most of us underwriters will rely or have been relying on reinsurers, and Pahelion, a UK-based company that is working on this with, of course, Ken Bright and FSD, has pledged to offer support, lots of technical capacity or technical assistance, support in training, in upskilling underwriters. And now these are the technical people who do the underwriting, upskilling them in knowing what exactly the kind of solutions to be offered, the pricing, etc. Now, as you mentioned, there are different stages of the geothermal phases. So there's the early stage phase, and then, almost the exploratory stage, the early stage, and then now when the project has actually taken off. And they say that, the highest risk is actually at early stage. And the question has been, how do we get in as underwriters? And not many are clear on how to do that. And so this pool provides the technical capacity, the know-how, and possibly in future, the ability to attract investment to support this kind of facility. And why it's an underwriting pool is we are also, as underwriters, going to be spreading our risks on this one. It's not something that, one or two underwriters will decide they're the ones who they're very high risk projects, but yet present lots of opportunities.
Great. So I hope the insurers in the room have heard that. I think that was crystal clear. So thank you, Dorothy. Now I will just ask Ayandev one more question, and then Shera one more question, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So Ayandev, you talked about agriculture insurance. What about universal healthcare? What can private insurance companies do in terms of just making universal healthcare part of their agenda as a company? Because again, just like you said, SDGs, we need to prevent people from falling into poverty. As we saw even in COVID, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of families were pushed into poverty just because of COVID alone. What can companies do when it comes to universal healthcare instead of just leaving it to the government?
Absolutely. You see, Sheila, again, it's a very important sector, as important as agriculture. And I always believe that agriculture financing and health financing are equally important. Now, when you look at most of the countries, and when we look at the health financing in terms of setting up healthcare facilities, as a percentage of GDP is very less. And that means that you need to find different ways of financing when it comes in terms of setting up this healthcare infrastructure. Now, if I just give a quick example, from India, and India had established a universal healthcare insurance mechanism for both formal, informal sector, people participating. So what happened was earlier, before this universal health system, the government used to set up the hospitals, government used to invest money in terms of setting up the healthcare infrastructure, pathological labs, primary healthcare centers, and clinics. Now, once they started a universal health insurance scheme involving the insurance companies, and it came as a health financing, these institutions, these hospital or healthcare providers, they started seeing business in those areas, especially in the rural areas. You see, the healthcare problem, the biggest, Sheila, is in the rural areas, right? Not mostly in the cities. It's there, but the biggest health protection gap or health service gap is at the rural areas. And there you need good infrastructure. You need to set up. And the government, how much can they spend? As I said, when you look at percentage of the GDP, spend on healthcare is very less. So you need a different financing mechanism. So I think that is where the insurance companies can play a role in participating in universal health insurance scheme. And Sheila, again, offline, we always keep discussing, should it be a self-funded by government, or should it follow a risk-based principles, whether insurance companies and underwriting universal health insurance scheme? I always believe in the second because it brings in a lot of efficiency. So today also when it comes to health insurance or healthcare facilities, especially during the COVID, we realize how important it is to optimize our health infrastructure. Now, this optimization can happen through insurance. Now, what I mean by that, today a person can stay over for a hospital treatment if he has the money for 10 days, where he's supposed to come out of the hospital and the hospital should be discharging him in 5 days. But today there is no one to question. Why no one to question? Because if I have the money and if I want to get more treatment, I stay back at the hospital. And the hospital has all good reasons to, especially the private healthcare providers, they have all good reasons to keep the patients in the hospital, right, without discussing more, right? Now, when there is an insurance, they actually works like a maker and checker, right? So they actually say, no, for malaria, for diarrhea, the average length of stay on our portfolio is say 5 days or 10 days. They start questioning on certain practices, certain principles related to healthcare usage. And that is where the insurance company's role comes in, and how insurance company can bring in more efficiency into the healthcare system, right? And also to do a lot, Sheila, with the technology. Today, you see how efficient we can be when it comes to technology. The law of large numbers, the more the people are included in the healthcare facilities, the more the facilities we have, we'll be able to reduce the per unit cost per patient for each and every element, right? So I think a lot of those things can happen, and especially data related, morbidity related analysis. Today, even with insurance, we can actually do ICD coding. We can set up a health data related capturing system in various healthcare providers, and we can get those data, do analysis, present it to the government for government's responses. So I think when I say universal healthcare, I think, Sheila, it's not only the insurance companies, but I think the regulator, the government, all needs to come together. Again, as you rightly said, it's part of SDG, but as I mentioned, today when we look at the percentage, the percentage of money that is spent of the GDP on healthcare is very, very less, and it gets less the poor or the developing the countries are, right? So it becomes more important to look at various financial instruments in terms of health financing.
Great. I love that. Ayandev, and I think it's a call to action for the companies that write medical insurance here. For what I hear from you is that, the social health insurers have access to the public, but the private insurers have the systems, the infrastructure, and so on. So what can they both do together to make sure that we're actually achieving universal healthcare? Great. So I can see we only have 2 questions. So I think I can ask Shera one last question when it comes to data protection. So we have the new Data Protection Act in Kenya, where Kenya's Data Protection Act offers the data subjects the right to be informed, to access, erasure, opt-out, rectification, data portability, and not to be subject to automated decision making. So basically, the Data Protection Act protects us as the people. So how does that affect insurance and pensions? And also, just related to that, there's this new proposal by KRA where they're going to be exchanging data with different countries on financial services. So for example, if I have an insurance policy in Kenya and I have another one in the US, KRA will be able to see that I have 2 different insurance policies, one in Kenya and one in the US. And then of course, there'll be the tax implications on that. So when it comes to the whole data question, what will be the impact on the insurance industry? So you can answer in about 2 to 3 minutes, and then we open the floor to the audience.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. I think that's a very important and very good question, especially with what is happening in the industry right now. I mean, for all businesses, we're all looking for customers. And as you're all looking for customers, databases become absolutely important and critical. And the question is then, for insurance companies that have these databases, what's to stop them from using that data to, catch more people into the net? And obviously the Data Protection Act has brought in some spanners in the works for them. But I think it's important. I mean, if you have my data and my data is there specifically for a particular policy, why should you use that for any other purpose without my permission? So I think with regards to the G in ESG, the governance side of things is, DPA is now trying to add teeth to the ESG side of things to say, let's make sure that you are using the data that you have for the purposes for which you collected it and not using it for any other things. Now, with regards to the KRA and their automatic exchange of information across countries, which I think for us kicks in this year, obviously, yes, from a tax perspective, we're looking to, I can imagine, KRA is saying, well, we have people all over the world earning all sorts of income. Are we collecting our share of our tax? And obviously this is coming through to collect that net. But again, I suppose it's in relation now to being truthful and honest from your governance standpoint that, you're going to do right wherever it is. So obviously that was going to bring about challenges for the people who are collecting that, especially if they've not declared. So I see a lot of people being caught into that net. From insurers' perspective, obviously the reporting requirements are going to start increasing, but I think related to that, the whole disclosure of, getting the right details of your membership and, to an extent, transferring back the liability, as it were, to the insured, so that if you don't disclose correctly, if the authority comes back to you and says, well, Shera, you have a policy here, you have a policy there, you have not declared, you have to hand it over, then the insurer is going to have to play ball. Back to you, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Shera. Okay, so now I will open it up for questions, and allow me to start with a very distinguished guest that we have in the webinar, allow me to start with his question. In case insurance regulators are to set an ESG regulatory framework, what essentially considered? Elias is around the question. Deal may regulations asset ESG regulatory framework.
Yeah, that's a good question, and great to have the director of BNA on this call, Dilme. And yeah, so there are a couple of principles that ideally will guide when it comes to framework for ESG on regulators. And if you look at the way the regulations are formulated, the first component is usually what is the objective, right? And if you look at it from the regulator's context, there are three things that comes into mind, particularly when you look at it from the insurance side. There are issues around underwriting, there are issues around risk management, there are issues around capital management. So how do the regulator want the companies to align the ESG related risks and opportunities around those three components? So the first level will be looking at it from the prudential side, and prudential side will be governed by those three key components. Then the second bit will be on the market conduct side. How then do we want them to conduct themselves around ESG? And I've seen a question around greenwashing. You don't want a scenario that have happened in the UK, which I was talking about when we started this particular call, a webinar, where there's a lady that has gone ahead and sued a company of greenwashing because in regard to the market conduct practices, the company that he invested with did not go ahead and invest in what we call sustainable investments or green investments. So the guideline will also look at the issues around the conduct of how the institutions that will be implementing ESG will be looking at that. The other component is on reporting, right? We want these particular companies to disclose on a number of metrics, so that the regulator will have an opportunity to gauge and to really have an oversight in terms of how the institutions are basically aligning their business processes, their operations, their strategy on ESG. So just the way policies are aligned, but these will be very specific to some key elements that in a long way will be able to create what we call sustainable insurance, and ideally ensure that the companies or the insurance companies or the financial institutions are keen on societal risks, governance issues, and also environmental alignments that need to be looked at. Yeah, that's it. And I know we are working with already Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, and soon definitely we'll be happy to see what we can do in Rwanda and guide on that particular process as I've kind of elaborated in my response. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elias. I think that is a very good insight when it comes to the regulation, the regulators supporting the ESG issues. So maybe we'll move on to the next question, and this is from Rhoda. I think, Rhoda, this is more of a social question, so maybe we'll direct it to Shera, given that she's well versed in this sector. So Rhoda is asking, to the pension industry, what are you doing exactly to ensure your clients have been guaranteed their pension? And then the next question is, there are clients who are never compensated for accidents, permanent disabilities that happen during their service to the government. So I think maybe this one, Shera, you can take this up, and then for question 2, I can allow Dorothy to respond to it.
Okay, thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Rhoda. In terms of what's the pensions industry doing towards ensuring remittance of pensions, obviously this is a bit of a mutual work with the individual member and the trustees and the administrator. So obviously you need to make sure you've collected everything and got all the right information, and you also have to take account of the local regulations with regards to payment of pensions. Like, a lot of people are not aware that, whilst you remain in the service of the employer, you cannot be paid your benefit. So as much as you may have been PNP and now you've joined on contract terms, you're still employed by the same employer, and under the regulations, we cannot pay your benefits. So I think it's sort of the working together to help the parties understand what is needed to process and making sure it gets done within the timelines. I mean, the industry, RBA has also set out timelines for payment of benefits. Within 30 days, you need to get your payments. Of course, that's subject to, tick boxing, everything else that needs to be ticked box. Elias, back to you.
Thanks. I've seen Sheila is back. So Sheila, welcome back. And maybe is there any other question, Lucy, that we might need to respond to?
I think, Elias, it was the question on the compensation.
Yeah, I think.
All right.
Question. So, okay, you can take it.
Yeah. So there are clients that were never compensated for accident on permanent disabilities that have been doing the service to the government, right? So it will depend with whether this particular who basically were covering these persons. And again, one of the key things that maybe I need to mention is that whenever maybe a client is not compensated, there are various channels that needs to be looked at in order to ensure that, people get the rightful compensation. So I think maybe it will be fair enough to kind of look at why, or basically where this issue arose, to see the reason why maybe they are never compensated. But again, I think for each and every government employee, there's some form of coverage when it comes to issues around permanent disability or temporary disability within their coverage. So it will be interesting to know why they are not compensated, and if there's anything that needs to be done. There are various channels that could be directed for them to get their rightful compensation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Elias. Maybe we can move on to, can get maybe two more questions. So we have a question from James. I think James is saying, and I think we can combine this with a question from Barbara. So James is saying, given we have finite resources, how does the panel think we should prioritize the ESG components? And if not, why not? I think this can be in line with the question that was asked by Barbara, where she's foreseeing risks and basically greenwashing, issues of greenwashing, and maybe this finite resources can be one of the factors that are going to promote the element of greenwashing. So maybe I can direct this to Dorothy. I don't know if Dorothy is still around. So maybe she can take this up.
Yes. Sorry, I can't see the chat, so I'm just hoping that I've gotten it. But the question to me, if I'm not wrong, it's how, if there are finite resources, how do we prioritize? Is that the question?
Yes. And maybe you can address it also in line with the element of greenwashing. Given that we have finite resources, how can we be able to okay, we can foresee that there's going to be an element, the issue of greenwashing. So how can we mitigate this risk?
So there are two aspects here. So as you know, we are living in a planet which is only so much, and I wish if you had time you look at something called the donut economy, whereby it explains how finite the resources that we are living in are and what we need to actually do to work within this limitation. So when it comes to ESG, it's difficult to prioritize and say, focus more on the environmental, then, after a couple of years, social, and maybe after some time, governance. The challenge is because these things are also interrelated. Physical risks from the climate change side are real. Transition risks, as we've mentioned, are so real. And for you as actuaries, if I may pick it with a question that I had seen earlier on from one of the registered attendees, the transition risk side is also so real because, if we end up with stranded assets, what will we insure? If there's stranded assets in the economy in a couple of years, actually BP, for example, in 2020, BP indicated that they were going to write down 17.5 billion of assets due to the fact that, number one, demand for oil will fall, and number two, that they're tightening regulations in terms of the shift to electric vehicles, etc. You have even seen that oil companies, Total, they are now moving into Total Energies. They're realigning their strategies, right? Now, the central banks of, I think it's actually France and the UK, had actually estimated, this was a research that was done in 2019, that the value of assets owned by coal, oil, and gas would risk being stranded to the tune of $20 trillion. Now, those are mind-boggling figures. Now, that's those markets. Now, the question for us as actuaries and for us in this call is, do we even have the quantification locally? What would be the effect on us in Africa and specifically for Kenya? And that's part of where, actuaries would fall in. But now I go back in terms of prioritization. I don't see how you can prioritize. The most important question is net zero an option or not? And as we all see and as we all know, it is possibly not an option. It may take us a bit longer to get there for us in Kenya and specifically in Africa, but it is clearly not an option. Given the fact that Kenya, for example, we are actually number 35 of the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate change. So, Lucy, can't quite say that, focus on this or the other first. For me, they're also interrelated, and what we need to do as underwriters is to set up the risk appetite in terms of ESG and to pursue products and solutions that will be more sustainable for us as underwriters, and of course that has an effect on the economy in future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dorothy, for those insights. I think I can say we've tackled basically all the questions that have been posted on the chat. So, and I think just from this discussion, it looks like we need actually more time to delve into the ESG issues, because even from this discussion, it seemed like you brought out other issues that even the training and education team, as well as the task force had not thought about it. So it was a very good insight from the three of our panelists, and we really want to thank you, to thank all of you for basically
Lucy, can
giving
you
your
take
views.
one question? Just one more.
Yeah.
Which
Okay.
I feel was sent even before the webinar, and I didn't get to address. Sorry, I had network issues at some point, but I would really like the panelists to all chip in on one last question. So the three of them, Dorothy, Ayandev, and Shera, starting with Dorothy. When it comes to pricing, we've talked so much about product development, but specifically when it comes to pricing, practically, how are we going to price transition risk, environmental risk, and so on into products? And then with Shera, I would want you to comment specifically when it comes to pricing of equities, of shares. So normally when you look at, right now when we look at shares like EABL and Safaricom and so on, what is reflected is market risk and credit risk. Yet, the biggest influencers of those equity prices is institutional investors. Who are the institutional investors? It is the pension schemes, it's the insurance schemes. So how do insurance schemes and pensions, how do insurance companies and pension schemes play their role so that the shares, the indices that we see on the market actually reflect ESG risks as well as market risk and credit risk and so on? And so, Lucy, if you allow, I would ask Dorothy, Ayandev, and Shera to answer that last question and give their final thoughts, and then we can close. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheila. Let me just very quickly, I think I have a minute, is for you as actuaries first understand what transition risk means or what it is. And then when underwriting these clients, it's important for you to start understanding what their carbon emissions intensities are. And there are ways first, some data can be obtained, like I said, in public databases. Some companies are actually also already calculating and providing those disclosures, or at least calculating them. Now, why is that important? Because if you're able to track or calculate, the greenhouse gas or carbon emissions that your clients or that our clients have within, as they're coming to us, or even within the portfolios, then you can know what kind of price to give to that client. And as an incentive, how do you start in building incentive programs, possibly as a reduction in the price for companies that are showing, that are able to show progress towards closing ESG risks, or companies that are actually able to show impact on the ESG side from a positive perspective, because those companies are actually less risk. They are less of a risk for you. So that's one way an actuary can do that.
Okay, thank you, Dorothy. And your closing remark?
So for me, the questions for you as actuaries are: how do you come in this part of in this engagement or this process? There are so many task forces that require your skills, and sitting in some of them, I see the gap from the Africa side. There is a task force, like I said, of climate-related financial disclosures. Those were actually very technical actuarial calculations and scenarios that were developed. There's a nature-related one. There are many others. There's one called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, and that particular one is actually saying that we should be able to price carbon and be able to provide those disclosures, and be able to, like you asked earlier, be able to include the carbon aspect when you are pricing products. So how can you act as an advisor to your institutions, even on strategy, on where they need to put their money into, on where they need to invest? Final thoughts: insurers play a triple role. You play a role as a risk manager, a risk carrier, and an investor. And all these three roles have certain obligations on you with regards to ESG.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. What a great way what a great call to action to leave us with. Thank you. And now I turn the question to Shera. And Shera, probably you can give the point of view of institutional investors like pension funds. How do they make sure that the ESG risks are actually reflected when it comes to the pricing of equity valuations? How do they add their voice to that?
Thanks, Sheila, for that. I think, the only way a voice is going to be heard properly is by the actions. So if today, for example, I believe that company X that is listed on the stock exchange is not living by the ESG standards that I abide to, then I show my action by not investing in it, right? It's a bit like what KRA did to get everyone to buy that VAT machine. Fine, if you don't want it, it's fine, but you, person who wants to claim it, I will not let you claim it unless you've got an official receipt. So, if the oil doesn't come out directly, you go around and collect the oil. So I think, from a pension fund or investor perspective, it's to now start talking with the money to say, if you're not going to abide by this, then I'm not going to invest with you. But, to the point that was made earlier is how do you measure it? Because the risk always is the greenwashing. I can put, in my reports, oh, I'm the best at this and I do this and I do that. But unless you have an independent party providing that confirmation that, yes, these are the ESG standards they have, and this is their score relative to those standards, you as an investor don't know. Right? So for example, let's take the Acorn Green Bond. There are obviously particular things they need to abide to with regards to that bond issuance, right? Where is the reporting to say that we are achieving XYZ in relation to this bond? Do we even care? For me as a member, what I'm interested in is at the end of the year, am I getting a double-digit return? Am I getting a single-digit return? If I'm getting a single-digit return, change the manager. I'm not looking at where have they invested? And okay, it's single digit because they've invested in an ESG related or a good ESG type. So I think, there's a lot of growth, education, communication that needs to happen. And to an extent, guys are going to have to start talking with their money to say, don't abide, I won't invest with you. So it's a difficult one. And in terms of pricing it, again, let's be honest, if you walk to a trustee today and if you talk to them about ESG, you'll find maybe 1 in 10 really understands ESG. 2 in 10 may have understood there's something called ESG. 7 out of 10, like, guys, I don't care, I'm interested in the bottom line. So in terms of that whole pricing, unless you put that now to your fund manager, guys, you will only invest in stocks that meet particular ESG standards. And this is the criteria. And then you have an independent party who provides that rating. So there are a number of global agencies that can provide that rating, but it's now for us as the consumers to understand it and then to utilize it.
Thank you, Shera. And again, back to education. And I think also a lot of what you said is a challenge for us as the ESG risks panel to actually provide those frameworks for reporting and disclosures. And so now we will finish with Ayandev. Ayandev, I'd like you to just comment when it comes to pricing of agriculture insurance, microinsurance products for health and so on. What are some of the considerations? And then you can give your closing remarks and then we will end the webinar.
Sheila, I think Ayandev's dropped off.
All right, okay, no problem. Okay, so thank you very much for attending the webinar. Sincere apologies for going over time. There was a lot to discuss. It's a very rich topic, and you'll be hearing from us about another webinar, and we hope that you'll attend the next one. As my panelists have rightly put to us, there's a lot of work to be done. Shera has told us about the importance of education. Dorothy has really called us to action as insurance companies. There's a lot out there on the internet that we can read, and I will ensure that we send that information across. There's a lot that the regulators can do, as Elias has told us. And so what I can end with is just a call to action. When it comes to ESG, we cannot afford to sit as the insurance and pensions industry and say that we are doing nothing. And so I will just invite Elias to give us the closing remarks of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Sheila, and the good work that you've done with the panel. And we really got a lot of information. And I think, yeah, we needed to have taken this maybe in a number of sessions because it's an information overload. Yeah, so we do thank our members for really joining because I've seen very many people have joined this particular webinar. And just to let you know, we are working together towards creating that change, and ideally we are still inviting. If you would want to join us in the task force meetings and also in the various work streams, kindly reach out to Njiru. Kindly, Njiru, you can put your email on the chat. You can reach out to Njiru. We have 5 work streams, and it will be great to incorporate you guys on what we are doing, just to ensure that as we also guide and lead this particular process, you are part of it. And yeah, we are open to really have some of you as members joining us to really work towards ensuring that this ESG doesn't become just a fancy word that people will be talking about, and then after some time another word comes up and people kind of pick that and run with it. So we want to ensure that it's rightful change, and we really drive strategy. So you can reach out to us, and we will be able to ensure that you work with us. Yeah, there are 5 work streams, and I did explain about them. And if you need more information, I know we'll be sharing the slides with all of you. And also, in case you have questions, kindly forward them to that particular email address. We'll be able to answer them. Until next time, thank you, and looking forward to discuss ESG issues in the next of our webinars. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.